Hello and welcome to our webinar, Connecting the Dots for Continuity in Early Childhood Assessment. Our presenters today are Dr. Samuel Meisels and Dr. Julie Culhane. Dr. Meisels is the founding executive director of the Buffett Early Childhood Institute at the University of Nebraska and holds the Richard D. Holland Presidential Chair in Early Childhood Development, a leading authority on the assessments of young children and early childhood development. Dr. Meisels is co-author of the Work Sampling System, the Early Screening Inventory, and the Ounce Scale. He served as president of the Pearson Institute, one of the country's premier graduate schools in child development, for 12 years and remains president emeritus. And he also has a distinguished 21-year research career at the University of Michigan, where he is a professor and research scientist emeritus. A former preschool, kindergarten, and first grade teacher, Dr. Meisels was a faculty member at the Tufts University for 8 years and director of the Elliott Pearson Children's School at Tufts, as well as senior advisor in early childhood development for the Developmental Profile Clinic of Boston's Children's Hospital. The author of more than 200 publications, he holds a master's and doctoral degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Roosevelt University in Chicago. In October 2019, Dr. Meisels received the Sims Mann Institute Whole Child Award for Visionary Leadership in recognition of his contributions to the field of early childhood development and education. Dr. Culhane is an independent early childhood consultant focused on performance assessment, screening, inclusion of children with special needs, assessing resiliency, and understanding child behavior. She worked for 35 years in public schools while providing professional development to public and private preschool programs across 50 states and Europe. Other experience includes a Fulbright Administrator's Award to Argentina and 6 years on the Massachusetts State Board of Early Education and Care. We also have Dr. Gloria McCoo, Dr. Anise Flowers, Dr. Maggie Chair, and Cindy Aganis today with us from Pearson, and they will monitor the chat box during the presentation. This webinar is being presented in broadcast audio only. Please turn up your computer speakers to hear. There are no phone dial-in options. If you're having any connectivity or audio issues, please click on the question mark at the top right-hand side of your screen for assistance. Please type any questions that you have into the chat box. We will answer your questions live, time permitting. There are no handouts for this webinar. And with all that being said, I will turn it over to Dr. Meisels.
Thank you, Sherry. It's my pleasure to be here. Good morning to all of you. Today, Julie and I will tell you about two performance assessments we are both very familiar with, the Ounce Scale and the Work Sampling System. In a few moments, Julie will tell you about the Ounce, and I'll describe Work Sampling, or WSS as we call it for short. I'm the creator and co-author of both the Ounce and WSS. I had a wonderful group of collaborators in all of this work. Without them, these assessments would never have achieved their potential. Our work on WSS began in the late 1980s, if you can believe it, when nearly all early childhood testing was normative, was standardized, and most of it was group administered and was rapidly increasing in frequency of use. The Ounce came some years afterwards in the late 90s. With both of these instruments, my intention was to devise an approach to assessment that would accomplish several important goals. Give teachers information about what children were learning or having trouble mastering, motivate children by recording and emphasizing their strengths and abilities, provide meaningful information for parents and policymakers, closely tie assessments to our knowledge of child development and to state and national curriculum standards, and finally, create assessments that would have a very strong research base and demonstrate validity. I believe that we succeeded in accomplishing these goals, especially with work sampling. Work sampling is a comprehensive approach to assessment for preschool through grade 3. It's now in its 5th edition and has been used by thousands of teachers, and hundreds of thousands of children have been exposed to it over the past 30+ years, all across the US and internationally. Its research base is extensive and is more complete than any other early childhood performance assessment. I'm going to take a moment now to introduce you to some of the thinking and rationale behind both of these instruments, WSS and OUNCE, so you'll have a better idea of why we did the work that we have done. For a very long time, early educators have been dealing with issues concerning testing. Because of this, it seems sensible to ask, where's the pressure coming from to test and assess children? I believe it's coming from state and national policymakers who want answers to 2 critically important questions. First, are children learning? And second, are public funds being used wisely? The first question goes to the heart of why policymakers have embraced early childhood programs. In the US, these programs are provided in part to recognize that, at least pre-COVID, most parents were and are in the workforce, and childcare is a necessity to maintain our economy. Beyond this, the US, like the rest of the world, is facing a prolonged and pernicious achievement and opportunity gap between students from economically more advantaged versus less advantaged families and families of color. Early childhood programs today are intended to close this gap, equalize opportunity, and enable our society to derive benefits from and for more of its citizens. The pre-K solution is meant to have an impact on these fundamental inequities. This leads directly to the second question regarding the value of the public investment these programs represent. In other words, if we can't show that the programs are improving learning, then how can we justify their cost? I believe that these questions are completely legitimate. I don't object to the questions. I take issue with how they're being answered. The problem is that conventional testing in early childhood typically creates more problems than it solves. It's my contention that conventional standardized testing may take its greatest toll on young children. This is because these children have not yet learned to play what we could call the school game. They're unable to balance test experiences and judgments with other life events. For them, an early introduction to high-stakes testing may influence their long-term beliefs, not just about what takes place in schools, but about their own intellectual capabilities and their sense of self. Remember, high-stakes tests are those directly linked to decisions important to a child's future, such as retention or promotion in a grade, tracking into achievement groups, and that sort of thing. For some time, we've known about something called the Pygmalion effect, a phenomenon that describes how teachers' perceptions can be altered by information from tests and other sources external to the classroom, regardless of the accuracy or relevance of this information to a child's learning capacities. For young children, one of the most significant risks of failure on high-stakes tests is the impact the test may have on their sense of self and on those who form judgments about them. Because the tests that are often used to track low-scoring children track them into low-achieving groups, this can contribute to a feeling of stigma and confirm children's sense of powerlessness, failure, and limited potential. Here are some of the factors and reasons these problems arise. First, as you see here, early development is episodic and uneven. There's a tremendous amount of instability, variability, and volatility in development. Young children go through major changes in brain growth, physiological development, and emotional regulation in the first 8 years of life. A brief snapshot taken on a single occasion can't begin to capture these shifts and changes in development. Second, the concept of readiness, which we all use, is relative. Readiness is a moving target. It's a fundamentally relative proposition that's dependent on the particular context in which it is used. One child may be ready in one classroom but not another, in one community but not another, in one domain of development but not another. A third issue is that test items often imply teaching. There's no other way to learn letters, colors, or numbers without some teaching and exposure. But children's opportunities to learn vastly differ, and young children are intensely vulnerable to these differences. To assume that a test administered at the outset of school can be used to make valid predictions that may have long-term consequences is to believe that these differences don't exist or are unchangeable. And finally, validity. Most of the tests used for assessing readiness have never been studied in terms of their accuracy. Their validity is suspect. The issue of early childhood test validity was examined in a study done several years ago by University of Virginia researchers. The predictive power of readiness tests was examined by conducting a meta-analysis, something that brings together more than 70 longitudinal studies that focused on early childhood testing. Their purpose was to examine the associations between academic or cognitive outcomes and social behavioral measures in preschool and kindergarten, comparing them with like measures in first and second grade. Amazingly, they found that only a quarter of the variance or overlap in early academic cognitive performance was predicted or explained by status on preschool or kindergarten cognitive tests. And 10% or less of the variance in kindergarten and grade 2 social behavioral measures was accounted for by similar measures at preschool and kindergarten. The researchers conclude that instability or change may be the rule rather than the exception during this period. And all of you who are teachers know this to be true. In short, their study shows that tests used to make classifications and predictions, even relatively short-term predictions from preschool or kindergarten to later grades, are insufficiently accurate to justify a decision about whether a child is ready for school. With this background, let's turn to a more detailed information on the ounce and on work sampling. You've already heard some of the background about Julie Culhane, but let me add a word or two personally. Julie and I have been colleagues for more than 30 years. Her school district where she started out in Western Massachusetts was one of the first in the nation to pilot work sampling when we began. Julie participated in all of the training sessions that we presented in her district and at the University of Michigan, where I was a faculty member at the time. Before long, my colleagues and I invited Julie to become one of our national trainers, and she has been doing this ever since. Julie is going to tell you about the ounce scale, and then I'll return to talk to you about WSS in more detail.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's good to be with you virtually, even though we can't be together physically. Thank you for that history. It really brought a big smile to my face and memories of all of our struggles and triumphs over the years. So it's nice to be working with you again. I'd like to welcome everyone else to the webinar. When I thought about the title of this webinar, Connecting the Dots in Early Childhood Assessment, it reminded me of one of the reasons that the ounce scale was created. For many years, people that we were teaching work sampling system to would approach us and say, when are you going to make work sampling for babies? So Sam, in his very resourceful and professional way, approached the Ounce of Prevention Foundation to fund the field trial of the ounce scale, and we were off and running. So not only do the ounce and work sampling connect to each other, they also do a wonderful job of connecting educators with caregivers, connecting caregivers with teachers, connecting teachers with parents and families. Those connections are really the core of the success of these assessments and how they have contributed to the changing field of early childhood. For years over my desk, I had a sign that said, "Children haven't changed, childhood has." Children have not changed over the years in terms of what they need and how they are perceived by the adults in their world. So let me begin by talking about one of the definitions of the ounce scale. It is an observational assessment, to be sure, It's also a functional assessment. And what we mean by functional is that instead of looking at milestones or accomplishments of children, the ounce scale really looks at the quality, how do children function in those skills and behaviors. So based on observing the children, we can measure those functions over time as they develop and grow. So an example of the opposite of functional assessment is milestone assessment. Milestone assessment really answers questions such as, is this child walking? Is this child feeding him or herself? Those are often yes or no questions. With the ounce scale, the question is really different. The question is, how is the child walking? How is the child learning to feed themselves? What is the function of the behaviors that they are being exposed to as they develop? So as a result, we are looking at what children are doing more through the lens of where are they at, rather than from the lens of have they gotten there yet. So it won't be any surprise to you that the ounce scale and work sampling have a number of similarities, including, as Sam mentioned, the authors. Sam and our colleague Dot Marsden were also authors of the ounce scale, along with Amy Laura Dombrow, Donna Weston, Abigail Jukes. One of the other things that these two assessments have in common is that they are a complementary process. Where it says D plus E equals A, it means that in order to assess a child, we need to first document what they're doing, either observing, participating with them, collecting the work that children do, or just making note of the functions that children are showing us in their everyday experience. When we add to the documentation the ability to evaluate that documentation, then we are really talking about an assessment. An evaluation without documentation is not going to get the job done. Documentation without a reliable way to evaluate it is not going to get the job done. So assessment in both of these instruments is really this complementary process. The fourth thing that they have in common is that both of them are ongoing versus on demand. On demand is an example of what used to happen Friday mornings in my elementary school. It was spelling test day. I always had a queasy stomach on Thursday night. Many of us are not good at on-demand testing or on-demand assessment. Many of us are good at showing what we can do over time. Without that pressure of having to be right or wrong, we really learn much more informative information about the child who is in our care or in our classroom. Can do is also a fundamental similarity between these two instruments. We really learn to focus on what the child can do, rather than making judgments about how they're performing. We look at what are they doing. We simply watch and we listen. The other similarity is that they are time framed. Work sampling has something called a collection period, where the ounce scale really is about age groups. The ounce starts with babies at birth and goes through 42 months or 3.5 years. So like work sampling, it has this organizational time frame to it that helps manage the task of assessing young children. They also are organized around areas of development, and you'll hear later from Sam about the domains and work sampling system. The ounce scale is organized around these 6 areas of development, which we'll look at in detail in just a moment. There's also a choice of being able to do work sample, the ounce scale, either on paper or online. Many of the materials come in Spanish and English language. The other commonality that they have is that it is based on observations and conversations. We know, especially in early childhood world, that working as a team with whoever else caring for this child really is critical to their own self-esteem and their success with learning and development. The last 2 similarities are their purpose. Both instruments are designed to support planning, to support instruction, both at the group level and the individual level. And they're also, the purpose is to create some reports that are really useful to families, that are useful to educators, different than the reporting that Sam talked about in his introduction. And finally, these are valid and reliable instruments when they are done correctly. And I'll tell you a little bit about the developmental profile informed by the developmental standards, which is what helps to make the ounce scale as reliable as it is. So for you visual learners, this is a reminder that this assessment and work sampling system are an ongoing process that starts with listening and watching children, that results in our documenting their learning. And those records, those documentations are used specifically for planning or adjusting instruction. Leads us right back to the observation stage. And so we see that this is really an ongoing process, much like a child's development is an ongoing process. So some of the things that make the ounce scale unique are they are comprised of key questions across the 8 age levels that I mentioned before. These questions are comprised of the common questions that teachers and parents have always been asking. The everyday practical questions about how is my child developing? What is next for my child? Where does my child need support? And the questions, of course, are answered through observation rather than requesting an answer from the children. The observations are evaluated by standards, and they result in instruction and planning, as I said before. So what makes you ounce scale unique is not only that it's a functional assessment, but that it is made up of questions. Unlike any other early childhood assessment that was around at the time when ounce was born. The value of the ounce scale is that it builds relationships. And those of you in our audience today who are using the ounce scale know how important it is to build relationships with the caregivers of the children. By presenting them with actual positive can-do information, that relationship becomes positive from the start and really functions to support the child as a team effort. Functional skills we talked about already, that rather than splinter skills or milestones. And the act of making a relationship with a parent and a teacher is that we really improve the knowledge of both of those people. To see the full child, we must have the views from both of those people who interact with the child. And finally, it blends assessment with intervention. Rather than being a standalone kind of a function, the assessment and the intervention go on hand in hand seamlessly to the eyes of most observers. So here's a visual look at the ounce scale, as I said before. You'll notice that there are the 8 age groups that we talked about. There are also these components, which I'll describe in detail in just a moment: the observation record, the family album, and the developmental profile and standards. So each age group has its own unique set of materials. Again, to review the areas of development, they are personal and social development, language and communication, cognition, and physical and motor development. We know as early childhood specialists that the core of learning is a positive self-attitude, a positive sense of self, and the ability to be friends, to make connections, to have the personal development that being part of a group brings. Without this personal and social development, the rest of learning is really challenged to a great extent. So I want to move now and talk about the observation record. The observation record is comprised of a series of very specific age-related questions. And as I said earlier, these are the questions that teachers and parents have been wondering about as long as they've been parents and teachers. And while the observation record and the family album are both based on questions, the wording is slightly different, and I'll give you an example of that shortly. So think of the observation record as serving the professional, a way to collect documentation that is answering specific questions. And let me go backwards and point this out. I meant to point this out before. You notice in the first year of life, the observation records are 4 months in length. We know that because children develop and grow quickly at that stage of life, we are going to be refreshing the materials that we use more frequently. Once the child becomes a toddler or 18 months old, the age groups are extended to 6 months period of time to reflect their development in that period of time. So the observation record is used for a number of months with each child. It's designed to be an individual observation record for each child as well. I'd like to introduce you to Kadarro. Kadarro is a little child that we met when work sampling was being piloted. And one of the most consistent things that we heard about Kadarro was that he was on the go. This is a really good illustration of who Kadarro is. Kadarro is in the age group of Toddler I. So we have now gone from the baby age to the toddler age. Kadarro lives with his mom, with his dad, with a younger sister, and he is in childcare so his parents can work. So here is Kadarro, and we'll follow him in a little more detail as we go along. So the observation record for Kadarro's age in the domain of personal connections, personal development. Listen to this first question. How does the toddler show that the presence of familiar adults helps her to do things on her own? I'm going to revisit this question when we get to the family album to show you how the essence of the question is the same, but the wording is slightly different. Under each question is a rationale that explains why the skill or behavior is as important as it is to young children. And it goes on to give some examples of how we might see or hear this behavior happening in an everyday situation. Down below is a place to include notes, to include dates, so that we can begin gathering over time a picture of how this child is developing in specific skills. So when we look at a different domain, understanding and communicating, at the toddler level, we're looking at 3 different questions. The first one has to do with receptive language. In other words, how does this toddler show that they understand words and that they can follow directions? Are they making meaning of what they are hearing? And how does this individual child show us that they are making meaning from what they are hearing? We also want to look at this stage of development, how the toddler is building their vocabulary or their expressive language. When the toddler is using words and word combinations to communicate, they have outgrown, for the most part, the stage of using a lot of gestures to communicate. Instead, they are beginning to use more words and word combinations. And very exciting at this stage of development is when conversation begins to be one of the questions. How does this toddler show he wants to begin to participate in conversations? If we think about adult conversations, they are essentially turn-taking. We listen, we speak. We listen, we speak. And children need to develop the ability to connect both of those skills in order to be able to converse with others their age or the adults around them. So this is an example of how the age-related materials change as children develop and grow older. Let's take a look at what Kadarro can do in terms of language. You'll notice that the data for Kadarro has been collected over a 5-month period of time, starting in January and ending in May. The top items are about Kadarro's receptive language. In other words, Kadarro turns around when he hears his name being called. Then in March, we see that Kadarro is looking up at the sky and saying airplane when he's hearing and making sense of that noise. And then in May, we see that Kadarro is putting his napkin in the garbage when he's reminded. These are the ways that Kadarro personally shows that he is understanding what is being said to him. If you look down now at the second entry in each of these groups, we are talking about, we have examples of how Kadarro expresses himself. So in January, he's pointing to a toy that he wants, very much a gesture. Often children make a sound with that gesture to communicate what it is that they want. In March, he's lifting up his arms to be picked up. Again, a gestural way of communicating. And in May, he's taking the adult's hand, leading me to the bookshelf and asks, book? So we see that his language is starting to include some words. It is still at the gestural stage. And then finally, the third entry here is about conversation. Kadarro's watching a friend of his who's crying, and he asks, huh? He really wants to be begin to understand his age mates and take turns finding out what it is that's going on with them. In the kitchen with a friend, he asks if he wants soup. The friend asks Kadarro, and he says yes. So see, again, actual vocabulary and conversation is coming into play. And then in May, Kadarro chatters back and forth with a friend as they ride bikes and using an occasional word. So I want to take this opportunity to remind all of you who are listening that we are welcoming questions. If, as you listen to my presentation about the ounce scale, if you have questions, you can enter them in the chat box. Likewise, if you have questions from Sam's opening remarks, please go ahead and enter those questions, and we will make time at the end of our webinar to address those questions specifically. If you're having trouble finding where the chat box is, just please send a message to Sherry, and she will help you with the technology of doing that. So I want to mention also that the ounce scale is also online. You'll see this image of a teacher using a cell phone to snap a picture of a child who is doing an activity with bears. More and more people in classrooms are using their tablets or their phones to take photos of children. And truly, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We know that by taking an image like this and using it to inform our evidence or our documentation, we can now link this activity to many different kinds of learning. There's mathematical thinking going on. There is also some color recognition going on, as you can see in the description. A little bit of counting is happening. So online, these documentations can also be entered and saved in place of the paper observation record. The observation record for the online system looks more like this, where we can enter also information about a specific child, or we can enter information about a small group of children. So just keep in mind that we also have this ability to complete the observation record in an electronic fashion by a server that will save and organize all the documents for us. I'd like to introduce you now to the family album. This is designed for as a vehicle to get input from the family, the parents or the caregivers of the child. It is written on a 5th grade reading level. And one of the things that you will notice about this family album cover is that the authors and the producers of the ounce scale went to I wouldn't say trouble, but they paid attention carefully to what kind of images they were showing. They use alternate language of he and she. They're showing people in different age groups. They're showing children with different skin tone. The whole idea is to make sure that the family album is inviting and welcoming to the world of the multicultural world that we are all working in and living in lately. So the booklet is designed to be used by parents or caregivers, as I said, and the questions are similar to those of the observation record. I'm going to show you that question about trust in just a moment. That includes, the family album also includes a list of activities. They are no-cost or low-cost activities that can be tried at home. We discovered in the pilot project that many, many different kinds of programs were making use of the family album as a way to connect directly with families, but also in home visiting programs. There would be conversation about the question from the family's point of view. Perhaps they would choose an activity, and then the next week that the home visitor went back, there was more conversation about the activities that the child had participated in order to begin to measure changes and skills that the child was developing. Sam, do you have your mic on? I think, or somebody has their mic on. If you could mute it, please. So one of the pages of the family album is called the gallery entry. Here is a photograph of Kadarro with his mom, And it is an illustration of the power of this book to let people express themselves in many different ways. We have in our collection family albums from the trial period of the ounce scale with beautiful illustrations by families who express themselves often in through the arts. We had people who dictated information in to be entered into the family album. Photographs, for example, this one of Kadarro and his mom. There are multiple ways that a family can express their interest in the children and what they're noticing about children. And one of the things that the pilot study really, it was almost an unexpected finding, was that people who were just developing literacy skills, either in their own language or just developing their English language skills, were very, very motivated to write about their children. It became sort of a reason, a motivating reason to improve literacy, the ability to express oneself in writing. So that was an unexpected finding in the pilot study that was really a valuable piece of information for us to carry forward. So I mentioned the family album here, and remember that question that was asked in the observation record. The question, the corresponding question in the family album is this: how does your toddler show that you help her explore and play? So this is the same question from the observation record that was worded this way: how does this toddler show that the presence of familiar adults helps her to do things? You know, that's kind of teacherese. It's teacher speak, if you will. The family album really makes an effort to simplify questions and to put a different lens on the same question. By wording it a little bit differently, it makes it more family friendly, and it also helps to teach the adult how to observe, what to listen for. And just like in the observation record, there is space for documenting, for taking notes. Just like in the observation record, there is a paragraph of rationale behind each question. And then under each question, there is also there are also examples of how might this child show what they are. How might this child show that the adult helping them is really important for them to learn how to be exploratory, how to be playful, how to make the best of their environment. And just like with children, we're probably not supposed to have a favorite child. I confess that I have a favorite part of the family album, and it is this page called Suggested Activities. Just look at the title of this page. Try this, see what happens. When we're building team with a parent and a family, what we want to do is wonder together. We don't have all the answers as professionals. We know that. This is the kind of language that we can use to really communicate. We are a team. We are in this together. So this page called Try This and See What Happens, again, is a list of very no-cost or low-cost activities that could go on pretty much any time. And what home visiting programs and early Head Start programs have been doing is that the adults, the teacher and the parent, if you will, choose an activity to try. And then the next time the home visitor is in the home, they can have a conversation about how did this activity work. If it worked or it didn't work, you can try something different. In Even Start, early Head Start programs, there's often a time when families meet together, back in the good old days when we could all be in the same room. And that family circle was often organized around these activities from the family album. People tried different activities. They were able to report how those activities, what experience they had with their child and those activities. A really critical part of the ounce scale is this book. This book, which is called The Standards for the Developmental Profiles. Lots and lots of research went into the creating these standards and articulating these standards. And what we have found over time is that these standards can be matched or fit with most state standards for early childhood learning, with many program standards such as Head Start. These standards align really well with the standards that are used with other entities. So if you would like to know more about the research that went into these standard booklets, you can read more about them. Just realized that we should get out some references for folks. So I'm going to make a note to myself that we would want to provide some resources and references as a follow-up to this webinar. So the standards for developmental profiles must be used to bring the reliability to the developmental profile. I think of it as sort of a funnel where we are putting together the information from answering the questions in the observation record, putting that together with information from the family album, and then comparing what we have discovered by answering the questions, what we have discovered, and can compare that then to the research standards for each age group. So the developmental standards, as I said, are very thoroughly researched for all the age groups that are covered in the ounce scale, from infants and toddlers and young preschoolers. Those developmental standards really describe how the child is developing. Are they developing as expected, or are they not developing as expected and need our attention to enhance that area of learning? So the developmental standards absolutely must be used before the rating on the developmental profile can happen. Absolutely essential. And you'll hear when Sam talks about work sampling system, there is also a resource called the Developmental Guidelines that works very much like these developmental standards. We must refer to them when it comes time to make the evaluation of the documents that we have collected. So circling back to Kadarro, we are going to look in this webinar at one of the pages from the developmental standards that's related to the communication and language domain. The standards are organized by age groups, the end of the age group. So you see that this is the standard for communicating at 24 months. There's the title of the domain. There is the item itself following simple directions and suggestions, followed by the rationale here. Again, this is a way to funnel the information that we've collected from observation record and from family album in order to come up with an evaluation rating. This is specific to toddler talk. What the standards go on to illustrate are two sets of examples. These examples are really helpful to people because by thinking about the documentation and comparing them to what these examples illustrate, we can decide whether the child is developing as expected in that particular area of development by just comparing what we know with what the standards book expresses. And notice that these are also in can-do terms. What we communicate to children should be in positive language. What we write about children should be in positive or can-do language. Because even if the child is not meeting the standards, we want to have a really good description of what we know about that child in that skill. So notice at the bottom of this page, there is a phrase, your example. The authors of the ounce scale and the authors of work sampling also really invite practitioners to enter their own examples of how we know children are developing as expected. As we experience more and more different cultures in our programs, more and more family structures, we really need to make sure that the examples that apply to our children that we are working with also become part of the Developmental Profiles book. In other words, you can add examples of what you see or what you hear in your own program. Practitioners are not allowed to change any domains. They're certainly not allowed to change any of the questions. They're very much encouraged to add examples from their everyday experience that really helps them to bring this standards book to life and reflect so many different children. So keep these examples in mind as we look at the flip side, which are descriptions about how do we know the child may need development in a specific area. It might be that the child is remaining remaining apart from the discussion that's happening at home, around the dinner table or wherever. When the child is asked to go get a diaper in the other room, they forget what they were told and start to play with toys. Doesn't that happen to all of us sometimes? We still need examples of how we know children are going to need development or need extra support in this area. As early childhood teachers, we are sometimes reluctant to say where the need is for fear that it will be perceived as something negative about the child. These materials and our work with people in the field is absolutely to encourage them to use these instruments to tell the truth, to give us information about the child. In addition to what they're doing well and easily, we also need examples and information about where the child might have a challenge. This is where the developmental learning goals for each individual child can be expressed. So as with the developing as expected examples, the needs development examples also are inviting your examples, the practitioner's example, to be added. And I might say also that we can add suggestions from our conversations and from the family album data that we're collecting as well. So at the end of the funnel, if you will, at the end of pulling together the answers to the questions in the observation record and in the family album, we now have something called the developmental profile. Those questions have now disappeared and they have turned into statements. The developmental profile is, again, very age specific. This profile is completed as the child is turning 24 months, as they are about 2 years old. basic information about their name, their birth date, their age, who their home visitor might be, who completed the assessment, etc. These developmental profiles occur in the rhythm of the child's age rather than in all at once. So what do I mean by that? In many programs, issuing a report happens at a specific time for everybody in the program. One of the unexpected findings, if you will, about the developmental profile is that programs that have a lot of children really appreciated that these developmental profiles became due at a more staggered pace. Rather than everybody's developmental profile being due in the same 2 weeks of the month, for example, it is due when the child changes age groups. So it really helps to keep the focus on individual children and make that task of reporting a much more manageable task because it's happening gradually. So let's take a look at Kadarro's developmental profile. We can see that when he's turning 24 months or 2 years old, Kadarro is developing as expected in virtually all of the items on the developmental profile. And there are comments included that were extracted from the observation record, from the family album, comments that really give us a picture of how we came to make that rating. You'll notice that there is one area of Kadarro's development that is checked in needs development, and that is his expressive language skills. We know from our documentation about Kadarro that he is still using a lot of gestures. He is starting at this stage of development to use a couple of words, but the standards remind us that at this age, children should be putting 1 or 2 words together in order to be rated as developing as expected. One of the things that I coach people to do when I'm teaching them to use the ounce scale is to sometimes come with this developmental profile incomplete, and instead to finish making the check marks in consultation with the parents. My experience as a special education teacher is that often parents, although they are reluctant to know that their child has a special need, they are grateful to know that somebody else recognizes it and has a supportive solution for that. So if we bring a developmental profile to a conversation that we suspect many of the areas are going to be checked needs development, we do that as a team. We talk about it in terms of goals. We talk about, rather than needs development, we phrase it to mean, where am I going to use my energies with Kadarro in the coming collection period, in the coming age group? So we teach people to really see this as a positive rather than a negative. At the bottom also is a place to sign and date, just as we do for other reports in schools. And developmental profiles are designed to become part of the child's permanent record. So as people using the ounce scale become more proficient and become more reliable in their ratings, these reports get added to permanent records as a way to keep track of how children are developing at these early stages of life. So I'm thinking now of beginning a transition back to Sam, who, as you know, is going to talk about work sampling system. I want to finish by looking at some of the common features of the ounce scale and work sampling system. The first set of common features was focused on the ounce scale. these common features are now focused on the work sampling system. You'll notice that two of the authors, Sam and Dot Marsden, appear on both of the publications. And I'm happy to say that Dot is comfortably retired. I'm still in touch with her. She's still an important person in my life. And when I first saw the title for this webinar, Connecting the Dots, it really made me reconnect to Dot and the work that we've done over the years. So Sam and Dot and Margot and Judy were the authors of Work Sampling System. It is based on the very same process that assessment is a complementary process, that we need both documentation and a way to evaluate that documentation. Work sampling is an ongoing assessment rather than an on-demand. The example I gave was spelling test on Friday mornings, which always gave me a stomach ache. Work sampling is also based on can-do, talking about what the child is able to do rather than what the child doesn't do or won't do. It is time-framed, where the ounce is framed by ages. The work sampling system is framed by collection periods. Both are organized around domains. The ounce scale has 6 domains or areas of development. The work sampling system has 7 domains. And in the case of work sampling for Head Start, there are 11 domains that complement the Head Start curriculum. Choice is on paper or online, as we talked about with the ounce, in English and Spanish language, based on observations. So in the ounce, where we're asking questions for the work sampling system, we are setting up learning environments to give children an experience with skills and behaviors that we can collect documentation from. The purpose is the same: planning, instruction, and reporting. The ounce scale also is used by early intervention programs, so it can be used as an intervention strategy as well. And then finally, the work sampling system is valid and reliable when it is done correctly. And I know from preparing this presentation with Sam that he's going to talk some about reliability and validity and some of the other features of work sampling system in more detail. Sam is also going to pick up work sampling at the kindergarten level and talk about the research that has been done connecting between assessment and kindergarten entry, or a child's readiness, if you will, for school. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sam, and we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Julie. I hope you can all hear me. Julie, can you hear me? All right.
Yes, I can, Sam. Loud and clear. Gotcha.
So I'm not going to spend a lot of more time on history. I will say to you that work sampling, was something that we began. I always believe in beginning big projects gradually, and we began work sampling as a kindergarten performance assessment, and then within a short period of time, we extended it down to age 3, and then beyond that, we extended it up to grade 3, and then we even extended to grade 5. We no longer use grades 4, 5, and even 6, which was finally developed, because there has really not been that much demand for that. But what you'll see today is age 3 through grade 3. And what we are talking about here is an observational assessment. Julie has given you a very, very good background on observational assessment for the ounce scale, and we look at it in the same way. It's observational assessments are also known as as authentic assessments or performance assessments. They focus on children's actual classroom work and accomplishments rather than the responses to formalized, decontextualized test items, what Julie was saying, on-demand items. Now, here is a formal definition of observational assessment. We define it as standards-based assessments. It's very important. Standards are there. That's the basis for the evaluations we make. Standards-based assessments that rely on teachers making systematic observations of children during the course of daily classroom experience. Largely, everything I'm going to tell you from now on has to do with those words in that definition. These assessments, by the way, consist of actual examples of classroom-based activities rather than the highly inferential estimates of learning that you see on most standardized and conventional tests. In the words of one researcher, and this may sound a little strange, but it's true, they are real instances of extended criterion performances, extended performances that are terribly important rather than substitutes or proxies or estimators of learning goals. They represent ongoing assessment rather than a single snapshot taken of narrow academic skills at one point in time. All you have to do is think back to your own experience, maybe your experience last weekend. I mean, any time in our life where somebody asked you to do something, you know you could do it, but you didn't do it right then. Does that mean you don't have the capacity, or does it mean it was really bad timing? Look at this. I mean, here we have these three little boys. What could they be learning if you're using, what could you learn about these three little boys that are using an observational assessment? You could learn about their knowledge about science. Their knowledge, you could listen to their language. You certainly would learn a lot about emotional regulation as they keep the sand in the sandbox and not throw it somewhere or drop it on the floor. You learn about mathematical concepts that they may have. All of these things are embedded in all of these wide range of children's skills are embedded in performance assessments. So they don't constrain us with short answer questions or with one approach to learning or problem solving. Instead, they demonstrate individual student learning over time. They're continuous, not one shot. You don't decide on an important decision, make it an important decision based on one assessment. And they help teachers by watching kids in their classrooms to differentiate their teaching and to plan for students with diverse abilities. They also connect directly to your focus on instruction rather than on comparisons to norms or to do-or-die test scores. What's more, they inform parents about children's learning in ways parents understand, functional ways, again, the way that Julie described function, based on observable skills and patterns. How does it help a parent? Just think about it. To know that his or her child is at the 85th percentile on the reading composite score of some test rather than knowing what their child reads, what his or her comprehension is like, which words the child tends to miss on a regular basis, and how to advance the child's interest and love of books. Performance assessment keep our attention where it belongs, on teaching and on learning. So what do observational assessments teach us? A whole huge number of things. They give teachers information about how children learn and what to do next. This is true both for ounce and for work sampling. They motivate children by emphasizing, helping you to emphasize their strengths and abilities. They provide meaningful information for parents and for policy makers, and even for developing IEPs. They provide educators with a shared set of expectations based on state and national standards and child development knowledge. So there's a great deal that you can obtain from using observational assessment. So here's how it's done. Again, very similar to what we built into the ounce, which Julie described as the assessment intervention cycle. Here what we say is we look at observing, recording, and evaluating in a natural environment in relation to standards. So what's the natural environment for preschool, kindergarten through third grade? It's the classroom. That's what we're looking at. In other words, teachers' judgments about children's skills, knowledge, and behavior are based on performances of the child that reflect standards, explicit, printed, written out standards. And all of this takes place in a natural setting, namely the classroom. In fact, another name for this approach is curriculum-embedded assessments. These assessments are based on students' typical classroom performance rather than on constructed response items. That's why we call it authentic and why we call it instructional assessments. They're intimately connected to teacher judgment also, which is absolutely important. What's assessed in the classroom is seen through the eyes and judgment of the teacher, but teacher judgment need not give rise to uncontrolled variation. As you can imagine, teachers observe, record, and evaluate children's performance. When they do that in relation to standards, the standards serve as the anchor that shapes and controls teacher judgment and helps us to develop and have reliability. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on work sampling. As I've told you, it is, many of you know this from using it, it's a continuous progress rather than something where you learn about something on a single date, but actually you're developing knowledge as you go. It's the history of the child's experience of learning in some ways. Continuous progress instructional assessment uses guidelines, checklists, and summary reports. And its purpose, help teachers document and assess children's skills, knowledge, behavior, and achievement from preschool through grade 3. So it has these elements, these 3 elements that I just mentioned there, 7 domains, which are personal and social, language and literacy, mathematical thinking, scientific thinking, social studies, the arts, and motor development. It goes across these years from age 3 through grade 3. There are 3 collection periods that are in the fall, the winter, and the spring. And information is available for teachers, for parents, for children, and for others. As I mentioned, this is a curriculum-embedded assessment. It's rich with and thick with the knowledge of what takes place in a classroom. If you read through the checklists and the guidelines and the summary reports of any given teacher, any given classroom, you can almost rebuild what takes place there. You learn so much about it. There are assessments based on evaluative information obtained from children's typical classroom experience. And let me tell you one more thing that this brings to my mind. I like to say that the indicator of learning, in other words, the criterion of a child's learning something, is the demonstration of that learning itself. In other words, we don't have to guess, we don't have to infer, we don't have to jump to conclusions. We are actually recording something that's happening. It's ongoing, and it demonstrates both qualitative and quantitative changes in the child's behavior and knowledge. Now, I'll give you a little bit of view, although I don't know if this is as small on your screen as it is on mine, which makes it impossible to view, but it's very available to you in our actual materials, which of course are online and which are also in paper. And so what I'm showing you here is a small portion of the kindergarten developmental checklist. The kindergarten checklist, and each age group has a slightly modified checklist and slightly modified guidelines. The kindergarten checklist consists of 85 items across the 7 domains I mentioned. What you're seeing here is intended to help you begin to get a sense of what teachers do when they implement work sampling. In this instance, they're observing for, I've just picked out a few items from the early literacy behaviors, such as understanding concepts of print, understanding phonological awareness, using phonics and word analysis skills, showing understanding of text, recounting key ideas, beginning to analyze and integrate knowledge from text, and reading for various purposes. Now, all of those kinds of things, if you are working, let's say, with kindergartners, you know those are the things you're working on in one way or another. What we've done is to organize it for you. Other components of language and literacy domain are included as well on the checklist, but teachers are taught how to rate children on each indicator using a modified mastery scale, not yet, in process, and proficient. We didn't want to say below average, average, above average. It was like saying unripe, ripe, overripe. We really worked at trying to get words that would make sense and would be understandable to you to administrators and especially to parents. The items on the checklist are criterion referenced and inherently meaningful. They're representative of the literacy construct, and they do not introduce things that are irrelevant to literacy. They help a teacher know what to look for, and they assist the teacher in evaluating the child's specific level of mastery, performance, or competence as defined in the standards. So the standards are, of course, extremely important. And here, again, in small print, are the developmental guidelines or the standards, and they begin with a brief rationale, which I haven't included here, for why the item is included on the checklist. We want people to understand why it's important. Then we provide a set of examples or illustrations that helps teachers learn what we mean by the item under consideration. On this slide, these guidelines items refer to demonstrates phonological awareness. Again, notice how representative of the domain of early childhood literacy these standards are. And as we said, as Julie pointed out, this isn't a complete enumeration. There are a lot of other possibilities which are part of our training and which are part of what we hope you will work on too. Now, the next slide here is an example of the omnibus guidelines. So we've collected 6 years of guidelines from preschool 3-year-olds through 3rd grade. And we take a single indicator and we show how that indicator is modified slightly over time. It really shows developmental growth. And any of you who are looking at this very closely may notice that I selected the wrong slide. I selected a slide that begins at kindergarten and goes through 5th grade. So we don't use that one anymore, as I told you, but what we do now is we have 3-year-old, 4-year-old, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. And this gives a tremendous amount of information. It answers the question of what do I do with a 5-year-old, with a 7-year-old, with a 6-year-old? It tells you what to do, and the entire range of all of our domains are represented in this fashion. The last component of work sampling is summary reports, which combine information from the domains. They rate student performance, highlight strengths, concerns, and plans. They need to be available for parents and for families as well. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go as quickly as I can. And I just want to leave you with this thought before I move on to talking about some of the research here. The best way to evaluate a child's performance is to study performance, not something else. You know, it's very, very strange to me. When we used to, before COVID, when you go to the theater, or when you watch a sporting event, or you go to a concert, you don't say, wow, that guy's really great. Now let's see how he does on the written test. You don't do that. But that's the kind of thing we do in administering tests in schools and classrooms. So instead of looking at what the child is doing in front of you, we have to go outside of the classroom and outside of their experience in order to do this. What work sampling teaches you to do is to use the information you have in front of you. I'm going to move quickly into some of the information that we have about accuracy or validity of work sampling. We also have validity that has been published and reliability on the ounce scale and on all of our instruments that we've developed. This is the big question to answer. Can we trust teachers' judgments? I've just told you that teacher judgment based on teacher judgment based on the use of the standards is crucial and critical to making evaluative statements in work sampling. So can we trust those judgments? Well, it seems to, many of you are teachers. I was a teacher long ago myself, and I work with teachers all the time and never stopped. It's almost embarrassing, it's almost insulting to say, can we trust teacher judgment? Well, we can. So we designed studies to show this. Here's one such study. Had 2 major questions. Is WSS a valid means of evaluating student achievement progress, and what's the impact of WSS on student learning? So the sample for this particular study, this was done in Pittsburgh, kindergarten to third grade, cross-sectional, which means that we looked at each grade separately, kindergarten, first, second, third grade, rather than looking at a child who began in kindergarten and went for 4 years, but rather we collected data on each grade. The total number was 345, 17 classrooms, 5 schools, and as you see from the description, the demographic description, it was a high-risk sample without question. The results from this study, after we did all of the work that we did, this is like jumping over a couple of years of work sampling correlates very well with a standardized, individually administered psychoeducational battery. The Woodcock-Johnson revised is what we use then. So one might say, well, why not just use the Woodcock-Johnson? Well, the reason is, of course, it takes 30 to 45 minutes, has to be administered by someone who's highly trained in that, and it does not give you classroom information. So, but we did want to know how does work sampling match up against it. We found it's also a reliable predictor of achievement ratings in kindergarten through third grade, more predictive than demographic variables. Third, data obtained from WSS accurately discriminated between children who are and who are not at risk. And let me show you now just some more actual data. What we did when kids reached third grade, they were all administered in Pittsburgh, the Illinois Test of Basic Skills, the ITBS. You probably have heard of that or use it or know about it. 3 groups were included in this study. One was work sampling children, that is those children who had been in work sampling, and these children had all been in work sampling for 4 years. So that's the red bar. The orange bar, which is in the middle, is the contrast group. This is a group of children who were matched on 5 different demographic variables. So they would be just like the work sampling kids, except they weren't in classrooms where work sampling was used. And then blue is another 2,000 or so average kids from Pittsburgh. So what you see on the left-hand set of bars is the reading scores on the ITBS, and on the right-hand side, the math scores on the reading on the ITBS. And you can see that WSS outperforms, those kids outperformed the kids just like them, but hugely, massively, we could say. More than 70% of the students, I'm sorry, I have the wrong number there. I'm just glancing at this. WSS students outperformed both the contrast and the other children who were just average in the district tremendously, both in reading and in math. So that, now, but does that say, this is a really important point, does work sampling make kids smarter? Should we bottle and sell it? No, that's not what it's about. It actually makes teachers better, and that makes kids better, because it focuses on individual differences, because it focuses across the entire curriculum, because it keeps you intact and in track on each kid. So you don't just pay attention to the very noisy or very bright kids and lose touch with the passive or the quiet or the unhappy kids. All kids are part of this. And it's that change in your outlook, which is what we all as teachers try to bring forward, that makes this very, very important. So the conclusions we draw from these kinds of studies are: work sampling is a valid and effective assessment of children's learning. Students in work sampling classrooms make significant achievement gains, and teachers and families are satisfied with the system and become more so as they have more experience with it. And I'm going to give you just one last study just to show you. This comes from the state of Minnesota, and Minnesota is a very interesting case because in Minnesota for many years, they administered a brief form, 32 items, representing 5 of the 7 domains, the checklist to 4-year-olds to evaluate children at the outset of kindergarten. So what you see are data from 2002 to 2008, but the state continued to use WSS for this purpose for several more years. Many teachers in Minnesota still do so. What these results show you is relatively stable performance of the kids in green, who are then my colors may be backwards. I'm not sure. The kids who are proficient are high and they are stable, and the kids who are in the middle in process are also very stable, and the kids who are not yet are very stable. But one more really interesting thing: Arthur Reynolds, a professor at the University of Minnesota, found that WSS in kindergarten predicted third grade state test achievement results significantly and consistently in reading and math. So students who had test results, who had higher WSS kindergarten scores, also had higher scores on the third grade criterion reference state test. And this was a very comprehensive study. It really showed a great deal about how valid this instrument is. So I will leave you with just one or two more thoughts. The best way to improve a child's performance is to teach the child. It's not to test the child. The basic assumption of most tests are that, especially high-stakes tests, is they can be a lever for educational improvement, because it's something that you have to get to. But the evidence from more than a decade of implementing No Child Left Behind was that No Child Left Behind had little impact on school achievement, and we know that substituting test prep for instruction does not improve learning. As others have noted, tests don't produce improved teaching and learning any more than a thermometer reduces fever. So my last image would be this: understanding the child within context is key to understanding the child. What work sampling and OUNTS allow you to do is to capture that context, capture it in a structured and important way, while keeping honest or being open to the everyday differences that children and teachers will show. We believe there is really nothing better to try and to use than these assessments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Meisels. I think there are a few questions. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so there is one question about the OUNTS scale and the work sampling system. Is there a reason that the two assessments weren't combined so they can follow the child seamlessly through all of the age levels?
Yes, absolutely. The reason is just that birth to 3-year-olds is so different from 3 to 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds. So we have to look at different things. So what we did was we actually do have an overlap. The last age range in the OUNTS, which goes up to 42 months, overlaps with the beginning collection period for 3-year-olds. So we actually, there you will see a very, very close correlation between the two. But it's just simply that you are looking for such different things in each of these age ranges that you can't have one be the same as the other.
Okay, thank you very much. And then a question maybe for you, Julie. What can be done, if anything, when a child needs additional help, which is free to them, but parent refuses to supply it? Maybe support that is available through the Universal Pre-K program.
Oh my, such a big question for a little bit of time. I think what can be done is trying to build a bridge, trying to find out why that parent is resistant to taking advantage of the services, and just asking the questions about where the resistance is coming from. On Friday, actually, we are doing a presentation about engaging with families and maintaining engagement with families. So if you have time to tune in again on Friday, we could give you some more specifics to answer your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And then there was a question about pre-K based on different types of play and how you collect information using the work sampling system. And again, we are going to be following up this presentation with a session on Thursday that'll go into more specificity on how we collect observational information or evidence for the work sampling system. So that question will be answered then for sure. So I hope you'll be able to join us then, Harold. And then there was another question, and maybe for you, Sam, about gender neutral. Have we given any thought to maybe revising the he and she usage on the OUNTS scale based on gender identity, or using more gender neutral statements?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the truth is, I have thought about it because all of us have become much more, some people were there already, but I certainly have become much more sensitive to this. We try very hard to be sensitive to this, but we can be more sensitive to this and also to differences that are associated with families who are experiencing racism and prejudice and fewer opportunities to learn based on the fact that they are people of color or their language at home is different and so forth. So all of that is part of the evolution in our thinking, everyone's thinking, and it needs to happen.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining us.